This program is made possible in part by the Maryland Arts Council through the State of Maryland and the National Endowment for the Arts and the Howard County Arts Council through a grant from Howard County government.
Hello and welcome to HoCoPoLitSo's The Writing Life. My name is Terence Winch, and it's my pleasure today to introduce you to Hugo Hamilton, one of Ireland's leading writers, or I should probably say one of Ireland, Germany's leading writers. His book, The Speckled People, a memoir that came out in, I think it was 2005?
2003.
2003. Became an international bestseller. It was a New York Times notable book and won any number of prizes in Europe. And it was a really unique and interesting exploration of identity with a focus on language. Hugo's also written a follow-up volume to that book called, in this country, called The Harbour Boys, and in Ireland called The Sailor in the Wardrobe. And is also the author of, is it 5 novels and a book of short stories?
That's right.
5 novels and a book of short stories. So very productive and accomplished artist that we're very happy to have here today. So welcome to The Writing Life, Hugo.
Thank you very much.
I wanted to jump right into the whole question of language. You grew up really with 3 native tongues. Grew up with Irish, German, and English as your 3 languages. And as your book makes clear, your father was kind of the controlling influence in that whole linguistic battlefield, and forbade the use of English inside the home. And you spoke mostly German and Irish in your own house. And as I was reading all of this, like most Americans, I'm sadly monolingual. And when I meet people who speak, as you do, 3 languages so fluently, I always feel this sense of envy, but also of intrigue. Like I wonder, how do the languages, what's that interplay like in your own interior life and in your own creative life? I mean, do you think in English? Do you dream in German? I mean, how does that all work out? I mean, because I really don't know, and I'd love for you to give us some insight into that.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I mean, it sounds great to be multilingual, but as a child, it certainly wasn't for me. It was a very problematic world. It still is, in a way, because when I think of certain words like caterpillar, that word will come to me first in German.
Oh, really?
And then it has to go around the whole house before I can come to the English version of it, you know. I only noticed the value of it now,
Sure.
later as a writer. But as a child, it was a big problem, because my mother came from Germany to Ireland in 1949, just after the war. And she met this very eccentric but very hard-working Irishman, and his whole ambition in life was to bring the Irish language back. It was the old language, the Gaelic language, which had, gone into decline in the 19th century, and there was a movement to get that language back as the national language, even though everybody in the country was speaking English. And in fact, my mother had initially come to Ireland to learn English in first place.
Was he a native Irish speaker?
He wasn't, actually. His parents would not have spoken in Irish at all. He learned it at school. Okay. So, but he made it his goal. It was an ideological battle that he took on, and he did this inside the family. In fact, he fought this cultural war in the family, and he forbade us children to speak any English, which gave us a very strange perspective on the world, because we had the German that we spoke to my mother. He spoke Irish to us, although he also spoke German to my mother. But then
where did he learn German?
He learned German during the war. I mean, the war years. He was very interested in Germany, and and in German music, and
so he had a great facility for languages.
Oh, he did. He was he was a self-made man. Like, he came from a very poor village in West Cork. Got his way through college, with scholarships and that. So he was very enthusiastic about learning new things and sort of reaching out to new places like Germany, which kind of contradicts his language war in a lot of ways as well, because he then sort of gets involved in this cultural crusade in a way to bring back the Irish language and to outlaw the English language, which is
beyond your own household.
Beyond the, yes, I mean, you have to understand, for us as children, is like we grow up in this kind of isolated little republic that he's set up, and we open the door and go out on the street, and this a completely different language that we don't speak.
Well, that's one of the really poignant things about the Speckled People, is that here you are, essentially this little Irish kid. I mean, you're born and raised in Ireland, but in many ways you're an outsider in Ireland. You're subject to all kinds of verbal and physical abuse from the other kids, and you're regarded really as pariahs in a lot of ways, which must have been just extraordinarily difficult.
Yeah, I mean, and it was doubly so because my father, in a way, by championing the Irish language, also turned himself into an outsider in a lot of ways. And so we were derided not just for being German, but also for being Irish speakers.
Yeah, right.
He claimed we were more Irish than the rest of the Irish. Yeah. But in actual fact, nobody really wanted to speak any Irish anymore.
Right.
So
was there a little bit of a contradiction there too, in this person who's a fierce Irish nationalist who wants to bring back the old language and scorn English and all of that, marrying a German woman?
Well, that's right.
You think he'd find, somebody on the Aran Islands to marry? Or
exactly. He should have gone to Connemara, married an Irish-speaking woman, and that would have been the end of the story in a way, But the fact is, he had a sort of he wanted to wage war on the English language. He wanted to take on this battle in a way, and that's his character. And that comes out in the writing of the Speckled People as well. Yeah. How he sort of, I like to say sometimes, that he asked my mother to marry him. Other times I say he conscripted her into this language war.
Did she have any idea what she was getting into?
No, I don't think so. No, I mean, she met this very enthusiastic, serious man. He was well read. And as she says in her diaries, in those days after the war, there weren't too many good men left in Germany, so you had to make a quick decision.
Yeah, right.
And she had no idea that she was letting herself in for this extended crusade. And she only really kind of discovered later on, like, how uncompromising my father was.
Yeah, he does sound like he was a really formidable force.
But she then also... the stereotypes are all turned around in my family. The idea that all the Irish people are always laughing and the German people are always serious.
Right.
I mean, that's turned around in my family, because it's my father who's the serious man, and my mother is always joking, and she's brought this wonderful humour with her from the Rhineland, and that's how she deals with life and his uncompromising the world that he created.
Well, getting back to that language question, though, was there a priority in your own mind as to which was your real language, or do the three happily coexist in your own imagination?
No, they didn't. I mean, we had German. I mean, I describe myself in the book as we woke up in Germany.
Right.
And then I look out the window and I see Ireland. I mean, I think the whole world speaks German.
Yeah.
Until I go out in the street and I discover, oh, hang on a sec, these people we're in a different country here. So it is effectively like emigrating every time we walk out the front door.
Did you learn English? Before you went to school, if you're living in this household where only German and Irish are allowed, how did you learn English?
We picked it up on the street. My mother secretly switched on the radio and listened to Louis Armstrong and things like that, which my father would not allow either, you know.
And that was enough too.
Well, we also learned it in school. We went to an all-Irish school, but the English language was learnt. It was taught as a foreign language, just to sort of exemplify the, you know, to
this was
exaggerate.
In Dunleary? Was this in Dunleary?
Close by, you know, and but then the funny thing was that, you know, although we were allowed to learn the language, we still weren't allowed to speak this language among ourselves. You know, so it was quite a bizarre.
Yeah, it is. It's very bizarre and very intriguing, and of course it had, in some ways, a great outcome in your work and in the way you've dealt with all of those conflicts. One thing when reading the memoirs that struck me was when someone reads the story of an Irish person growing up in the, you know, the 50s and 60s, etc., you expect to see a lot more about religion, and I was kind of waiting for, you know, you, the character in your memoir, to discuss, you know, Irish Catholicism and its effect and impact on you, but there's not much in there. About that.
And that's very interesting that you picked that up, because I mean, religion was everywhere. I mean, it's a bit like John McGahern, the Irish writer, said, it's you can't avoid religion. It's like the weather.
Exactly.
And I felt the same. I mean, I thought, you know, the real complication for us was the nationalism and the kind of the national identity issues that I had to deal with. You know, was I German? Was I Irish? You know, the thing is, you know, my mother at one stage got lederhosen, these German leather trousers from Germany, sent over from Germany.
Yeah.
So on the outside, we were dressed in it for Germany, and then my father, to kind of make sure that we weren't getting too German, put us in Ireland sweaters. You know, so we had Ireland sweaters on top and these German lederhosen at the underneath. And my mother says we were Irish on top and German below, you know.
Didn't start a craze in Ireland, I guess.
It certainly didn't. You know, we were just the funniest thing going around the streets there.
Well, that's hard for a kid.
Very difficult.
To stick out like that. Yeah.
And you were regularly put on trial and executed.
Yes, and there's some terrible, moving scenes in the books about that, about the neighborhood kids really ganging up on you and your brother and putting you on trial and smacking you around, and that's
and
very,
I think it's particularly difficult for my mother to understand that, because her family were against the Nazis. Like, her uncle got thrown out of office. He was the mayor of the town.
Yes,
he got thrown out of office because he wouldn't go along with the Nazis. Her sister eventually harboured a Jewish woman in Salzburg.
Yeah.
So they weren't behind Hitler, and she then comes to Ireland, and her own kids are accused of being Eichmann and Hitler and whatever. You know. I think that added to the kind of isolation that my father had created for her as well, and you know, in this kind of language struggle.
But the church was still a potent force in your lives?
They were both very strong Catholics. I mean, I think sometimes, you know, there was actually a contest between my father and mother to see which was more Catholic than the other. You know?
Really?
But I felt that was, you know, not actually the issue. That was something that all Irish children grew up with. And so I consciously, as a writer, decided not to focus on that. I mean,
when I noticed it not being kind of a significant part of the narrative, I thought, oh, you know, maybe they were free thinkers or something, or maybe you all didn't get the same dose of Irish Catholicism that most of us got coming out of that.
Oh no, it's there. Like on the first page, like we go down to mass. Oh yeah, I was afraid of going to hell all the time as a child, but I was more afraid of my father and more afraid of the English language. I think, you know.
I wanted to ask you, of course, the big Irish memoir that preceded yours was Frank McCourt's Angela's Ashes, and I know there's been comparisons made between your book and his. And I don't want to get into that, really. I mean, there's no point of that. But I did wonder what kind of research you did in writing both volumes of the memoir. One of the things I noticed was that there were a few markers, like there's a timelessness about the narratives. There are a few dates, there are a few anchors where we can kind of, you'll mention the Vietnam War or the Irish, rights movement in the North, etc. But you really kind of keep things in a very sort of timeless realm. And you also deal, though, with a lot of family history, some of it going back to early childhood. How did you, what was your process like in preparing to write those books, and what kind of research did you have to do, if any?
Well, I read a lot of memoirs before that, and I very much admired Frank McCourt's book for the kind of honesty of talking about poverty in Ireland, which nobody ever did before.
I did too. I felt similarly.
So it was important for me to read all those memoirs, and not just Irish ones, but all those German memoirs, and Elias Canetti is one of the people I really admired. But then there was also this research that I had to carry out on my own life, and a lot of it comes from the fact that my mother left diaries behind. It was something people did in those days.
Yes.
And it was also sort of a feature of her loneliness in Ireland, that her only real friend in life was her diary. That's where she could, really open herself up. And so that was a sort of a template for the book in a lot of ways. She was very honest in her diaries, and it, and the issue of this kind of amorphous tone that's there in the book, like with no dates and no street names and things like that. That felt to me like an important way of describing my thinking about myself. That I'm lost in this world where it is timeless, and we don't
Which
have
childhood often it feels like.
Yeah, and it. I preferred not to name the streets and to make it sort of, But there also was an interesting thing when I was writing the book, is that the whole story of my childhood and all the sort of very embarrassing, troubling bits, I had hidden all of that right into my 40s. I'd never even told any of my friends about it. So that when the book was published, they were completely surprised by the information. So it was almost as if my childhood carried on right into my 40s.
Wow, that's interesting.
And only then, as I start writing The Speckled People, that I actually go back and examine all of those things. Everything was on ice, in effect. I didn't even talk to my brothers and sisters about it.
While you were writing it?
Well, then, that was part of the research.
What prompted you to write it in the first place? Anything in particular, or just you recognized it was great material?
No, I mean, I always tried to run from it. But I had become a writer in some ways in order to try and explain myself. You see, I think I'm unlike Frank McCourt in this way, that he was able to go around and tell people about his past long before he wrote his book. You know? I wasn't like that. I wasn't able to tell these very awkward, embarrassing stories about how I was executed as a Nazi. They were not kind of good stories to tell in Irish pubs.
I want to. We're starting to come to the latter part of our discussion here today, and I did want to get off the Speckled People and the Harbor Boys for a few minutes and talk about the work that preceded that and some of the work that's come since. I mean, you're a very prolific novelist, and your latest book, I think, is The Hand in the Fire, right? The latest novel. And you've done a kind of retracing of Heinrich Boll's Irish journal as well.
That's right, yeah.
And I wonder if you could just give us some sense of, when I read Hand in the Fire, I thought, wow, this is like almost like a classic book of 20th century modernism. I mean, there were like echoes of Kafka and Beckett and that kind of thing. Well, at the same time, all of these very contemporary issues of identity and all that come into play. And clearly your background and your upbringing as this kind of cultural outsider is very, very evident in the character of Vid
Chosic.
Yeah, the narrator of this book, who's kind of a classic naive narrator who misunderstands and misinterprets things and goes through all kinds of adventures in Ireland as an outsider. And I wonder if you could give us, there was an article in the New York Times Magazine about a month ago, and it was entitled, "Why Write Novels at All?" And Garth Hallberg was the author, and he said, he discusses the ways fiction can help us, quote, resist existential loneliness as a motive for writing novels, but he cites the growing ability of technology to instruct and delight us, and wonders whether the delight offered by literary fiction will be enough to compete with Silicon Valley's offerings. And I wonder if you had any quick thoughts about, your life as a novelist in the kind of world we live in today.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of question of, whether the novel is going to be dead or if it's going to still survive. That's been around for a long time now, but still people are writing and reading a lot of novels.
Yeah.
I think the most important thing to remember is like that people always need stories. I mean, we can't survive without stories.
Right.
I mean, it's almost like trying to survive without food. We need to be reminded of how we think and how our inner lives work. So that's why we like to go to movies and read novels. And I often say, I was lucky because I became a novelist and told my own story. I often say that, the loneliest person in the world is the person who can't tell his own story.
Yeah.
And that's how I was before I came around to writing,
But of course, there are so many elements of your story in your fiction, even before the Speckled People.
I mean, it's always. I think your novels are always in a self-examination to some degree.
Yeah.
Okay, some novelists are great at hiding, but later on, when sort of academics go back and look at things, they find out how close it is to the personal life. I think it's always a way of describing your own story and your own reaction to the world, And I suppose, as you described in my latest novel, Hand in the Fire, it is my version of the world.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
the immigrant coming to Ireland, unable to understand the world, I mean, for instance, when I was in my 20s, I still had a lot of trouble with learning the English language. I didn't have the same fluency that other people had. So at one stage, I decided, I'll learn off a whole lot of jokes. And, so I rehearsed them at home and I got the punchline right and then went into the pubs and told them, but nobody ever laughed, I was wondering what was wrong with me, But it is something, there's something underneath the words, like that shows that I'm not quite at home in Ireland, and I think people sort of it's written on my face, I think.
Well, Hugo, I have about 3 or 4 hours more of questions and topics I'd love to cover, but we're coming down to the wire here, and I wonder whether I could get you to read a passage from the Speckled People, just so our viewers can get an idea of what your work sounds like read by you. And this is a passage from the Speckled People about Gaelic, the Irish language.
Okay. Gaelic in Ireland is called Irish, so that Irish people will remember what country they're living in. Some people say that the Irish language reminds them of the big famine, when they had nothing to eat except the old poems in Irish. My father says people transferred everything they owned into English, their stories and their songs, even all their memories and their family photographs. They deny that Irish has anything to do with them anymore. But some of their ways of saying things come down from the old bards, even if they don't know it. Time didn't just begin in Ireland with the English language, he says. And just because they all speak English so well doesn't mean the Irish are not blind anymore and that they know where they're going. There are some things you can only remember in Irish. One day, the Irish people will wake up and wonder if they're still Irish, he says.
That's wonderful. That's terrific. Hugo, we only have a minute or so left, and I did want to touch briefly upon the whole question of your German side, your German identity, because you did grow up with that. And could you give me a sense of how that works in your own life, and actually how you're regarded in Germany?
Well, I think that was one of the most difficult parts of my identity problems, in a way that it wasn't easy to be a German or to be linked to Germany. We were always called Nazis and that sort of went very deep into my inner life. And I even remember seeing my mother on the street and running away, because if I saw her and met her, I would be outed as a German again.
Yeah.
So ultimately, part of writing The Speckled People was owning up to that Germanness and also to German history. And I've done what a lot of the Germans have done, since the war, which was to sort of examine that history. And that, in a way, makes it easier to be German now. I like going to Germany. I like, I'm published there. The book is a great success there as well. I mean...
Do you speak German with an Irish accent?
I do a little bit. And I speak in a sort of slightly archaic German, and they laugh at me a bit,
Yeah.
I'm still in the kitchen with my mother,
Yeah. Well, listen, it's really been wonderful. I wish we had more time to talk today. It's been great having you as a guest on the show.
Well, thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Yes, and thank you very much for watching today. On behalf of HoCoPoLitSo's The Writing Life, this is Terence Winch, and we'll see you next time.